Here we are live, a somber and sober June 5th, Friday. We're contemplating the job numbers today, but also many, many other milestones. And my guest today is a good friend, Solana Rice. Solana is the executive director of a wonderful organization, a nonprofit that's been doing some terrific and important work in terms of not only unemployment and the economy, but also the possibilities for Black people to move ahead. Solana, are you there? There she
Hi,
is.
I
Okay.
am.
Liberation in a Generation is your organization. And Solana, I just want to thank you for all the work, the wonderful work that you've been doing.
Thanks for having me, Bob. It's good to see you.
And what are you thinking about today? I mean, I said a moment ago that this is a somber and sober Friday, the 5th of June. A lot of things actually to be talking about and to be concerned about. And there are some landmarks, some things we ought to be really starting our discussion with.
Yeah, I want to start by acknowledging all of the lives that have been lost recently, and particular Breonna Taylor. Today would have been her 27th birthday. And I was thinking about actually where I was when I was 27, and I was living and working in St. Louis County, as a matter of fact. And I was working in North County, which is home to Ferguson. And that was a couple years, not too many years before Michael Brown was murdered. So these murders are obviously on my mind. And what I'm hoping is that these lives haven't been lost in vain, and that we are thinking about not only justice in the moment and transformation on the horizon, but a real restructuring. So I'm looking forward to talking more about what that looks like.
Well, so that lives have not been lost in vain, so that the protests around this country are not for naught. I want to talk to you about that because it's very easy to talk about abstractions, job numbers and number of people who are out of work, generally speaking. But there's no question that Black people in this country have been suffering economically. I mean, even the latest job numbers today, Solana, we see that Black unemployment continues to be substantially higher than white unemployment. I mean, there is no good news in terms of unemployment, a slight downtick in the unemployment rate. But there are deep structural issues in terms of racism in this country. And, the only silver lining I see on the last 10 days is that maybe enough people are beginning to see it that we can expect, assuming that there is a Democrat in the White House and maybe the Democrats flip the Senate, maybe we can see and expect some changes. But, I've been around so long, it's hard for me to be optimistic. And maybe, I hope you are.
I am, although I really agree with you that this is a cycle that we see over and over again, that Black unemployment is always much higher than our national rates. And that is very much, as to what you said, it's about structural racism and systemic racism in our economy. And, I think what's interesting is that we can make a direct line from what we're seeing, people protesting, to our economy and what's wrong. So in every city that there's a protest going on, these major cities, right? DC, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, we see Black unemployment rates, double, triple, quadruple that of white people. And so when you see people in the streets and they're in Target, that is an economic statement. That's not just, we just want justice. for the people who have been murdered. Yes, we do. But that is also about this issue of economic oppression generally. So, at Liberation in a Generation, we've thought a lot about this cycle that we see, this sort of cycle of oppression, where it starts with the fact that racism is profitable. And that is a key broken part of this economy, right? When racism is profitable, we're going to see we should expect to see numbers like this for Black and Latinx and Asian Pacific Islander and Indigenous people over and over again. And that in turn leads to economic oppression, right? We have 20, when you think about all of the things that we really need, being able to profit from racism obviously leads to economic suppression. Thinking about that, then diminishing our political power in turn. And that political power, when we don't have the ability to change the people who are representing us, that means we can't influence the democracy and the rules by which we make a profit. And so that cycle continues again. So racism will be profitable. And we see this in the criminal justice system over and over again. So, I think we're talking about police and defunding police today, but that's just one tool of, honestly, white supremacy, right? That really if we're talking about defunding the police and police abolition, we also have to be talking about prison abolition. And we have to be really clear with ourselves that ending the prison and police state is an economic hit. And it's an economic strategy, right? That industry is a $182 billion profit-making industry. So, I think we have to be making these connections between the immediate and acute pains that we feel when the long arm of justice is bearing down on our necks. But we have to connect that to systemic forces.
Solana, when you say racism is profitable, you pointed just now to the prison industrial complex, $180 billion. Are there other specific examples that you can point to in terms of how racism is profitable, at least for certain sectors of this economy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so before Liberation in a Generation, I worked on a lot of financial inclusion work, and we see that over and over again. Predatory lending, right? So we have this cycle of, people of color don't make a lot of money, and so they need to make ends meet. They go to a payday lender. Those payday lenders are in their communities even more often than like a McDonald's. In many communities, you'll find more payday lenders and check cashers than McDonald's. And that's by design, because the banks can get away with not serving people of color. And so again, we see this sort of exclusion from the mainstream financial system by a depression of wages, and then an exploitation by saying, guess what? We're here to help you. We're here to provide a product that we know you'll never be able to pay back, right? And then it starts this terrible cycle of debt.
I was just going to say, in terms of payday lending, Solana, I've been on meetings and on the phone and continuously talking to legislators around the country. Many of them tell me the same thing. They are trying to regulate or limit payday lending. And for those of you watching, you probably know already, payday lenders are charging disproportionate numbers of Black people and Latino people. They're charging them 300% or 1,000% interest on these loans. And these legislators, who have the best of intent, are trying to get some control over payday lenders. But what they tell me is that the lobbying by the payday lenders, by the financial industry, and the big banks behind them is so intense, because there's so much money at stake, that they have an almost impossible task of getting any kind of regulation through. And this is true even in a blue state like California, Solana. In fact, I was on a call yesterday with a legislator in California who said the payday lenders and the big banks behind them are making it impossible to have any reform of payday lending. This is in the middle of the protests, in the middle of a movement to hopefully, ideally, change the allocation of power and make economic justice and get rid of institutional racism. This legislator said the lobbyists are too strong. How do we get over this?
I'm so glad you raised that, because that is part of the cycle, right? That is the diminishing of the political power of people of color. And I'm very concerned. I stay up some nights very worried that we are not being intentional about building the political power of people of color. And when I say we're not being intentional, I actually mean there are parties, specifically the Democratic Party, that is not interested in actually reaching out and earning the vote of Black people, of Latinx people, of people who have been excluded, because it is only through our political voice that we can even stand up to these forces, right? We have to have all kinds of reforms. I mean, campaign finance reform, but you spoke directly to it. We don't have, as people of color, we don't have the money and the moneyed interest to stand up to and have as large of a voice as these lobbyists do. And that has everything to do with all kinds of corporate concentration, our wages and our wealth as people of color being suppressed. So, gosh, where do we start? It's a big problem. The fact that we don't have as strong of a political voice as these lobbyists who are representing corporations that are exploiting our financial security and making us financially insecure, and at the same time overshadowing our political power.
Police brutality is obviously a huge problem, and we can't ignore it in talking about all of these large structural economic issues. But the question is, how do we get from one to the other? That is, how do we get from a massive protest, a movement that actually is very popular? I mean, if you look at the polls, white people are supporting Black Lives Matter as never before. You have a moment historically when it is possible actually to pivot from just kind of what we have seen for years and years and years in terms of racism to the larger economic and structural racism. How do we do it politically? You raised the politics. How do we get the Democrats to pay attention?
Well, one thing, I think that this party has to, like I said, really demonstrate that it's ready to earn the votes of Black and Latinx, Asian, young people. And that means speaking directly, whether it's the nominee or somebody that's representing the nominee. I also think that the party cannot assume that people aren't paying attention, right? Just because we cannot gather in person as we typically have, people are still very attuned. And so this pick for vice president will be very important. And what I am hopeful about is that this is going to be a pick that is not just a person of color just to be a person of color. We have to have someone who actually cares and is listening and is willing to admit that they might not know everything about racism, about systemic oppression, and about really about our racial economy, our racialized economy, and all of the intricacies of it, right? And so that's not just necessarily a person of color. Any person of color will do. And I think you're seeing headlines now that there's concern I mean, if you have someone as your running mate that has a history in law enforcement and criminal justice, that might not cut it for a lot of people of color. So earning the vote, picking well, and having advisors that are actually listening to people and reflecting that listening, I think is very important. I mean, the openness of making these unity task forces transparent, I also think is just makes good sense. Like, if you're really going to set up task forces that talk about policy and a new economy, and how do you do healthcare, and how do you think about climate change, make these open conversations.
In terms of open conversations, let's talk about that for a second, Solana, because it seems to be right now the Democratic Party and also Joe Biden. I mean, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what they're doing. I hear a little bit because I have some ties, obviously, into the Democratic Party and into previous administrations. But if I were right now in your shoes, I'm an old white man. You're a young black woman, and I'm not pretending to be anybody who is capable of actually getting in your shoes. But what would you say to Joe Biden? What would you say? What would you advise him right now? We are at an inflection point potentially in this country. We have a pandemic inside a pandemic inside a pandemic. That is, we have stresses that this country has not actually endured before, at least in living memory. It is possible to do something, and do something huge and important. But as you just said, to paraphrase what you just said, nothing, whether we're talking about payday lending or police abuse or criminal justice reform or any of the other issues that are so critical right now, nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen unless there's political power. So what do you say to Joe Biden?
I say, listen to Black people. I say, listen to Latinx people. I say, listen to people of color and young people, and demonstrate that you've heard them, which means you might have to do something differently in terms of strategy and in terms of the policies that are a core part of the platform. I think this is, again, earning the vote. There has to be a recognition that there are actually three choices. There's another party, there's the Democratic Party, and there's staying at home. And there is that real possibility that people will stay at home. And so we have to keep fighting for the vote. You don't show up to a basketball game and say, like, all my fans are here, we're going to win this game. No, you earn it. You work for it. You get a strategy that continues to win over your fans. And you might even win over some fans that you didn't expect. But you've got to earn the vote. Yeah, and like I said, I think the pick is really important. And I think who this candidate is surrounding himself with is also very important. And there's opportunity for leadership right now. We have a dearth of leadership. So those are the things.
I want to just push on this because this is really central. In 1968, when I graduated from college, the Fair Housing Act was passed. There were a lot of great society programs that, and a lot of, I worked for Robert F. Kennedy. I mean, there were a lot of things that were going on, and America was just waking up to structural racism. But now we are 52 years later, and the wealth gap between Black America and white America is as large. The typical white American has 10 times the wealth of the typical Black American today, which is exactly the same difference as it was in 1968. There has been on that level, on just the crass economic reality, Solana, no progress. So when you say, Joe Biden has got to have the right advisors, he's got to listen carefully, and it's got to be but doesn't that have to be backed by some real political change, or at least political organization and mobilization, to make this work, to make history sort of alter the course it's been on, which is that although we talk a good game, and arguably, the civil rights movement has made a little bit of progress, in just basic economic issues, there has been very, very little progress for Black people.
Agreed. I do think that we, I've worked in the nonprofit sector for a very long time, and what I've seen is that our connection, our ability to connect to the groups that are building real political power in communities, folks like the Young Invincibles, the Dream Defenders, the Movement for Black Lives, BYP 100, right? Being able to connect to those groups, having a policy analysis and framework, and then actually being able to build the political power to change and honestly replace the people that are not really representing us. That is where I feel like we're missing that togetherness. We're missing that that collaboration and that coordination. That is the only thing that we can really pull together to combat what you mentioned earlier, which is the political lobbying power, right, of corporations with a lot of money. And so for me, I think in part, you mentioned our history of 30, 40 years. We are just coming out, I think, what I hope is these tactics, at least in the nonprofit sector, around helping people save, around working around the edges, around really changing people's behavior, but not changing the systems in which we have to navigate. And I think especially this younger generation understands that these systems are broken and no one should have to navigate them. And that, these small reforms are not going to cut it. I'm really excited to join. We have a group of economic justice advocates of color that have been thinking about what is this new story of the economy. And you can check out our piece that we put out. We have sort of 4 big tenets around what this next economy needs to look like. It's a piece on Medium. Around 20 plus progressive leaders are coming together. And I think that is the first step, is that we have lots of experts of color thinking about many dimensions of our economy and ways to pull in not just like the think tank folks, but also the people who are building in progressive power in their communities amongst people of color.
That's encouraging. And the next question is, how do you get those think tanks and the people who have that expertise, often focused on particular particular policy issues, to see the connections between the policy issues, and not just to come up with a laundry list of, wouldn't it be nice if this policy was changed or this policy was changed, but actually to talk about power. Because a subtext of our entire conversation has been the relationship between racism and structural racism and change in structural racism and political power. How do you get the experts and the advisors and all of the policy people to understand the importance, the centrality of political power?
I was one of those people that would head into an office and say like, hey, I've got this idea and we've researched it and we have numbers and we think this is a really important policy. And they ask the legislator asks, okay, you and who else thinks this is a good idea? I think it's, we often didn't have a great answer. We would say like, well, our other think tank friends feel like this is a good move. I think we are at the point where we have to flip our entire model of where our policy ideas come from. They have got to be generated from the people who are actually living on the front lines of this broken economy. Like, we just don't have that luxury to think in abstractions anymore. And we don't need to. There's real leadership and expertise in communities and amongst people of color at all levels of our ecosystem, right? In the nonprofit leadership, in progressive power building movements, in philanthropy, and in political leadership. We have the interest and the will and the expertise. It's, again, I think it's about that coordination.
But let me just, we don't have a huge amount of time, and I want to get this as concrete as we possibly can. Because when I was talking with this state legislator the other day about payday lending, and she was saying she's overwhelmed with the lobbyists on the other side, she also said something very interesting to me. She said, and she was a person of color, she said that the lobbyists on the other side are hiding behind small businesses. They're hiding behind all sorts of other people, some of them people of color and minority businesses. But the real power is in the big banks, the people and the institutions that don't want any change. They're making the biggest profits off of racism are the big banks that are hiding behind all of these other businesses that are doing the lobbying on their behalf. How do we expose the reality of power, the reality of where racism is profitable in this society, so all can see it, and so it can be not only condemned, but we can actually have a shot at changing that power structure?
We recently talked to one of our friends over at an organization called ACRE. His name is Maurice BP Weeks, and he says, like other folks have said, follow the money. And I think that story that you just told is a clear story about, if you follow the money far enough, we get to these huge financial institutions, which, let's be clear, is also about corporate concentration. And I think that it is our next battle is to be able to connect in a narrative way who are the heroes and real villains in this economy. And so there does need to be, and I don't have all the answers about how do we connect all of the energy that is happening in protest right now to these big structural reforms around, like, why do we have only 5 major banks that have so much undue control over our political and our policy makers, right? We have to be able to, as consumers, as workers, as entrepreneurs, we have to be able to use that power to really call to question why we have so much corporate concentration that has undue control and power over our systems, over our economic systems, over our democratic systems.
So another thing,
I think that just means building a different infrastructure on the other side.
Absolutely. And another thing you asked Joe Biden is, are you going to use antitrust laws to break up concentrations of economic power that make it harder for everybody, but particularly harder for people of color to actually get the financing they need and start the businesses they need and get the toehold they need in this new economy? Solana Rice, you are great. You give me optimism. I started out in this half hour saying that I was pessimistic. Well, I'm less pessimistic having talked to you. In fact, every time I talk to you, I feel better. Keep up the great work you are doing. And in these very, very trying, difficult times, continue to speak out and continue your fight, because it's a fight we are all in. I am one of your allies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.